The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her equipment one final time. Her unit, Bravo Company, had been tasked with a routine patrol through the Eastern District, but nothing felt routine in this war-torn city. The weight of her body armor pressed against her shoulders as she adjusted her helmet. The familiar feeling both comforting and burdensome. Rodriguez had been in Iraq for 8 months now, long enough to know that the quiet moments were often the most dangerous. The city seemed unusually still that morning, with fewer civilians on the streets than usual. Even the stray dogs that normally wandered between the damaged buildings had disappeared somewhere safer. Her squad consisted of 12 soldiers, each one battle-tested and reliable. Corporal Jake Thompson walked point, his eyes constantly scanning the rooftops and doorways. Private First Class Sarah Chen handled communications, her radio crackling occasionally with updates from base. The rest of the team maintained their positions in the formation they had practiced countless times. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Intelligence reports suggested insurgent activity in a residential area 3 blocks from their current position. Their job was to investigate, gather information, and report back. No direct engagement was expected, but Rodriguez knew better than to trust expectations in Fallujah. As they moved through the narrow streets, Rodriguez noticed the unusual silence. Windows that should have shown signs of daily life remained shuttered. Children who normally played in the alleys were nowhere to be seen. The absence of normal activity made her skin crawl with anticipation. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, appeared at the corner of a building ahead of them. She looked directly at Rodriguez and shook her head slightly before disappearing back around the corner. It was a warning, and Rodriguez recognized it immediately. She raised her hand, signaling the squad to halt. Thompson dropped to one knee, his rifle raised toward the rooftops. The team automatically spread into defensive positions, using doorways and debris for cover. Rodriguez studied the street ahead, looking for any sign of what had spooked the local population. The attack began with the sharp crack of a sniper rifle. The bullet struck the wall inches from Chen's head, sending fragments of concrete into the air. Rodriguez shouted orders as her team scattered for better cover. The narrow street that had seemed like a simple pathway moments before now felt like a deadly corridor with enemies on all sides. More shots rang out from multiple directions. Rodriguez counted at least 4 different positions based on the sound signatures. Her team returned fire toward the muzzle flashes they could identify. But the insurgents had chosen their positions well. Every rooftop, every window, every alley seemed to conceal another threat. Thompson called out targets as he spotted them, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Rooftop, 11 o'clock. Second building. His rifle barked in response to his own call-out, and one of the enemy positions went silent. The firefight intensified as more insurgents joined the attack. Rodriguez realized they were facing a much larger force than intelligence had suggested. What was supposed to be a small group of fighters had turned into a coordinated ambush involving dozens of attackers. Chen worked frantically with her radio, trying to establish contact with headquarters. The buildings around them seemed to interfere with the signal, and her calls for backup went unanswered. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to try fighting their way back to safer territory, rather than wait for support that might not come. The retreat began in good order, with the team providing covering fire for each other as they moved from position to position. But the insurgents had anticipated this move and had positioned fighters to block their escape routes. Every street corner became a new battlefield, every doorway a potential death trap. As the fighting continued, Rodriguez realized they were being herded toward a specific area. The enemy wasn't just trying to kill them. They were being driven into what felt like a carefully planned trap. She tried to alter their route, but every alternative path seemed equally dangerous. The ammunition count became a constant concern as the firefight stretched on. Each soldier carefully managed their rounds, making every shot count. Rodriguez found herself calculating how long they could sustain this level of combat before running out of ammunition entirely. During a brief lull in the firing, she gathered her team in the ruins of what had once been a small shop. The walls provided temporary protection, but she knew they couldn't stay there long. She looked at the faces of her soldiers, seeing the same determination she felt, mixed with the growing realization of how desperate their situation had become. The enemy seemed to have unlimited ammunition and reinforcements. Every time her team eliminated one position, two more seemed to take its place. Rodriguez began to suspect they were facing a much larger operation than a simple insurgent cell. Private Martinez, the youngest member of her squad, had taken a bullet through his shoulder but continued fighting with grim determination. She helped him bandage the wound using supplies from their medical kit, knowing they couldn't afford to carry wounded soldiers if they needed to move quickly. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the battle continued. Sweat poured down Rodriguez's face inside her helmet, mixing with dust and smoke from the explosions around them. The physical exhaustion of combat began to wear on all of them, but the adrenaline kept them moving. As evening approached, Rodriguez realized they had been fighting continuously for nearly 6 hours. The insurgents showed no signs of retreating or running low on ammunition. Her own team was down to their last magazines, and she knew they needed to find a solution soon. The decision to make a final push came when Chen finally managed to reach headquarters on the radio. The message was brief and broken by static, but Rodriguez understood that help was coming. They just needed to survive long enough for it to arrive. She gathered her remaining team members and outlined a desperate plan. They would use their last grenades to create a diversion, then attempt to reach a more defensible position in a partially destroyed building 2 blocks away. It was risky, but staying in their current location meant certain death. The final assault began with the coordinated throw of their remaining grenades. The explosions created enough confusion to allow Rodriguez and her team to sprint across open ground toward their objective. Enemy fire followed them every step of the way, bullets whining past their heads and striking the ground at their feet. Thompson made it halfway across the street before an enemy bullet found its mark. He stumbled but kept running, one hand pressed against his leg where blood was already soaking through his uniform. Rodriguez grabbed his arm and helped him cover the remaining distance to their destination. The building they had chosen for their final stand was a 3-story structure that had been partially collapsed by previous fighting. The ground floor offered multiple entry points, but the upper floors provided good sight lines for defensive fire. Rodriguez positioned her team to cover all approaches while conserving their remaining ammunition for the most critical targets. As darkness fell over Fallujah, the insurgents launched what seemed like their final coordinated attack. Dozens of muzzle flashes lit up the night as enemy fighters closed in from all directions. Rodriguez's team fought with desperate efficiency, making every shot count as their ammunition dwindled to almost nothing. The sound of approaching helicopters in the distance gave Rodriguez hope, but she knew they still had to survive the next few minutes. The enemy seemed to realize that reinforcements were coming and increased the intensity of their attack, determined to finish the job before help could arrive. In the final moments before the rescue helicopters arrived, Rodriguez found herself down to her last magazine. The weight of command pressed heavily on her shoulders as she watched her soldiers fighting with everything they had. She knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether any of them saw home again. The story of those 18 rounds of sustained combat would become legendary among the soldiers who served in Fallujah. But for Rodriguez and her team, it was simply about survival and the bonds forged in the crucible of battle. The explosion that separated Rodriguez from her rescue threw her through the air like a discarded toy. She hit the ground hard, her helmet cracking against broken concrete as debris rained down around her. For several moments, she lay still in the rubble, her ears ringing so loudly she couldn't hear anything else. The taste of blood filled her mouth, and dust coated every surface of her gear. When her vision finally cleared, Rodriguez realized she was alone in what remained of a collapsed building. The rescue helicopters she had heard approaching were nowhere to be seen, and the sounds of battle had moved to a different part of the city. She tried to move and immediately felt sharp pain shooting through her left leg. Looking down, she saw a piece of metal debris had punctured her thigh, though fortunately it seemed to have missed any major arteries. Her radio had been damaged in the explosion. The display cracked and unresponsive. She pressed the transmit button repeatedly, hoping to raise someone on the emergency frequency, but heard only static. The realization that she was completely cut off from friendly forces hit her like a physical blow. Rodriguez took inventory of her remaining supplies. Her rifle had survived the blast, though the scope was cracked. She had 2 magazines of ammunition left, plus the partial magazine already loaded in her weapon. Her medical kit contained enough supplies to treat her leg wound, but not much else. Most importantly, she had less than half a canteen of water remaining. The building around her offered both protection and danger. The collapsed sections provided concealment from anyone searching the area, but the unstable structure could collapse further at any moment. She could hear voices in the distance, speaking Arabic, and knew that insurgent forces were likely searching for survivors from the battle. Using her knife, Rodriguez carefully cut away the fabric around her wound and assessed the damage. The metal fragment had gone deep, but appeared to be acting as a plug, preventing severe bleeding. She knew better than to remove it without proper medical facilities available. Instead, she cleaned around the wound as best she could and wrapped it tightly with gauze from her medical kit. Moving became a careful process of testing each step before committing her full weight. The injured leg couldn't bear much pressure, so she had to rely on her rifle as a makeshift crutch. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she knew staying in one place too long would be fatal. The search for a better hiding place led her deeper into the ruins of the building. She found a small space in what had once been a bathroom, where fallen beams created a natural shelter. The area was barely large enough for one person, but it was completely hidden from view and had only one entrance she could defend. As night fell, Rodriguez began to understand the full extent of her situation. The sounds of insurgent patrols grew more frequent as they systematically searched the area. She could hear them moving through the ruins, calling to each other as they checked every possible hiding spot. Several times, footsteps passed within feet of her concealment. The first night was the longest of her life. Every sound made her grip her rifle tighter, ready to fight if discovered. The pain from her leg wound made it impossible to find a comfortable position, and she drifted in and out of exhausted sleep. When dawn finally arrived, she heard the insurgents moving away to search other areas. Water became her primary concern as the second day began. The desert heat was already building, and she knew dehydration would kill her long before her wound became infected. She carefully rationed the remaining water in her canteen, allowing herself only small sips at measured intervals. During the daylight hours, Rodriguez observed the patterns of activity around her hiding place. Insurgent patrols came through regularly, but they seemed to be following predictable routes. Local civilians occasionally moved through the area, but they appeared to be avoiding the heavily damaged sections where she was hidden. Her military training had prepared her for survival situations, but the reality was far more challenging than any exercise. The constant pain from her wound, combined with hunger and thirst, made it difficult to think clearly. She forced herself to maintain mental discipline, reviewing escape routes and defensive positions to keep her mind sharp. The second afternoon brought a new challenge when she heard the sound of machinery approaching. Through gaps in the rubble, she could see insurgent fighters setting up what appeared to be a checkpoint at the end of the street. They were clearly planning to maintain a long-term presence in the area, which would make any escape attempt far more dangerous. As evening approached, Rodriguez made a difficult decision. She would have to leave her hiding place during the night to search for water. Her canteen was nearly empty, and she knew she wouldn't survive another full day without finding more. The risk of being discovered was enormous, but dehydration was a certain death sentence. She waited until well past midnight before beginning her careful movement through the ruins. Every step had to be tested for loose debris that might make noise. Her injured leg made the process incredibly slow, and she had to stop frequently to rest and listen for any signs of enemy activity. The search for water led her to a partially destroyed house 3 buildings away from her hiding spot. She found a small amount of water in a broken pipe, though she had to let the sediment settle before it was safe to drink. The liquid tasted of rust and concrete dust, but it was the most refreshing thing she had ever experienced. While collecting the water, Rodriguez discovered something that gave her hope. In the ruins of what had been a kitchen, she found several cans of food that had survived the destruction. The labels were in Arabic, but the contents appeared to be vegetables or fruit. She carefully opened one can and found what seemed to be canned peaches. Though she couldn't be certain in the darkness, the return journey to her hiding place took nearly 2 hours. She had to detour around an insurgent guard post that hadn't been there during her outbound trip. At one point, she found herself lying motionless behind a pile of rubble as 2 fighters walked past. Their conversation casual, as if they were simply out for an evening stroll. Back in her concealment, Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The food and water would buy her more time, but she knew her situation remained desperate. Her leg wound was showing signs of infection despite her efforts to keep it clean, and she was running a low-grade fever. The 3rd day brought renewed insurgent activity as more fighters arrived in the area. She could hear them setting up more permanent positions, and the sound of construction suggested they were fortifying their checkpoint. Her window for escape was closing rapidly as the enemy consolidated their control over the neighborhood. During the afternoon, Rodriguez heard something that made her heart race with hope. In the distance, barely audible over the ambient noise of the city, she could hear the distinctive sound of American helicopters. They were conducting search patterns, flying low over different sections of the city. She realized that friendly forces were looking for her. The challenge became how to signal them without revealing her position to the insurgents on the ground. Her survival mirror had been lost in the explosion, and any other signal method risked drawing enemy fire. She would have to wait for the right moment when aircraft were overhead, but ground forces were not in the immediate area. As the sun began to set on her 2nd full day in hiding, Rodriguez prepared for what might be her final night. Her ammunition was limited, her wound was worsening, and the insurgents were clearly planning to maintain a permanent presence in the area. She had to find a way to signal friendly forces before her condition deteriorated further. The sound of approaching helicopters grew stronger as darkness fell. Rodriguez realized this might be her only chance for rescue, but timing would be everything. She would need to expose herself at exactly the right moment to signal the aircraft while avoiding detection by the enemy forces surrounding her position. Her survival had become a delicate balance of patience, courage, and calculated risk. Every decision could mean the difference between rescue and death, and she knew the next few hours would determine her fate. Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison studied the satellite images spread across the table in the temporary operations center. 2 days had passed since Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been reported missing in action, and the search efforts had yielded no results. Her squad had been evacuated after the fierce firefight, but Rodriguez had vanished in the explosion that separated her from the rescue helicopters. The SEAL team assigned to the search and rescue mission had been working around the clock, analyzing every piece of intelligence and conducting systematic sweeps of the area where Rodriguez was last seen. The challenge was enormous. The neighborhood was heavily controlled by insurgent forces, and any large-scale operation would likely result in civilian casualties and potentially harm Rodriguez if she was still alive. Morrison's team consisted of 6 highly trained operators, each with years of experience in urban combat and rescue operations. Petty Officer First Class Carlos Snake Ramirez specialized in close-quarters combat and medical support. Senior Chief Petty Officer Mike Diesel Thompson was their demolitions expert and heavy weapons specialist. The team also included Petty Officer Second Class Tony Ghost Chen, their communications and surveillance expert, along with 2 other operators who brought specific skills in reconnaissance and marksmanship. The intelligence picture had been developing slowly. Drone surveillance showed increased insurgent activity in the area where Rodriguez was believed to be missing, but it also revealed something interesting. The enemy forces were conducting their own search operations, suggesting they hadn't found her either. This gave Morrison hope that she was still alive and successfully evading capture. Ghost had been monitoring enemy communications for the past 48 hours, intercepting radio chatter that provided valuable insights into insurgent movements. The enemy was clearly frustrated by their inability to locate Rodriguez, and their search patterns were becoming more systematic and thorough. Morrison knew they were running out of time. The mission planning session stretched into the early hours of the morning as the team worked out the details of their approach. The insurgent checkpoint at the end of Rodriguez's last known street presented a significant obstacle. They had at least 8 fighters with heavy weapons and good sightlines in all directions. A direct assault would be possible, but would likely compromise the stealth needed for a successful rescue. Morrison decided on a multi-phase approach. The team would insert via helicopter at a distance from the target area, then move on foot through a route that avoided the main insurgent positions. Ghost would provide overwatch and communications support from an elevated position, while the rest of the team conducted the actual search and rescue. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, with the aircraft touching down briefly in a vacant lot almost a mile from the target area. The team moved out immediately, using night vision equipment to navigate through the dark streets. The city at night was eerily quiet, with most civilians staying indoors to avoid the ongoing violence. Moving through Fallujah required extreme caution. Every intersection had to be cleared carefully. Every rooftop checked for potential threats. The team used hand signals exclusively, maintaining radio silence except for emergency communications. Their movement was deliberately slow and methodical, prioritizing stealth over speed. Ghost established his overwatch position on the roof of a partially destroyed building that provided excellent sightlines over the target area. Through his scope, he could see the insurgent checkpoint clearly, counting at least 10 fighters with several heavy weapons. The enemy was alert and professional, rotating guard duties and maintaining good security procedures. Meanwhile, Rodriguez was experiencing her most critical hours. Her fever had worsened during the 3rd night, and the infection in her leg wound was spreading despite her efforts to keep it clean. She had rationed her food and water carefully, but her supplies were nearly exhausted. The sound of helicopters had given her hope, but she hadn't been able to make contact. The breakthrough came when Ghost noticed something unusual through his surveillance equipment. While scanning the ruins for any sign of Rodriguez, he detected what appeared to be a small reflection from deep within a collapsed building. It was barely visible and could have been dismissed as debris, but something about the pattern caught his attention. Morrison received Ghost's report and decided to investigate. The building in question was approximately 200 meters from the insurgent checkpoint, well within their security perimeter. Reaching it would require the team to move through heavily watched territory without being detected. The approach took over an hour of careful movement. The team had to bypass 2 insurgent patrols and wait for a 3rd to pass before they could reach the target building. Every step was planned and coordinated, with team members providing security for each other as they advanced through the rubble-filled streets. When they finally reached the building, Morrison could see why Ghost had noticed the reflection. Buried deep in the ruins was what appeared to be a small piece of military equipment, possibly part of a soldier's gear. The discovery filled him with both hope and dread. It could indicate Rodriguez's location, but it might also mark where she had died. Snake took point as they began carefully searching through the collapsed structure. The building was extremely unstable, with loose debris threatening to shift at any moment. They had to move slowly to avoid making noise that would attract insurgent attention, while also being careful not to cause further collapse. The search seemed hopeless at first. Room after room revealed nothing but destruction and debris. The team was beginning to think the reflection had been a false lead when Snake heard something that made him freeze in place. It was barely audible, but it sounded like human breathing coming from somewhere deeper in the ruins. Rodriguez heard the footsteps approaching her hiding place and prepared for what she thought would be her final firefight. She had 1 magazine left in her rifle and was barely conscious from fever and dehydration. Through the gaps in the debris, she could see movement, but couldn't identify whether it was friendly or enemy forces. The moment of contact was almost anticlimactic. Snake called out softly using the challenge phrase that would identify him as friendly, and Rodriguez responded with the correct password, despite her weakened condition. The relief in her voice was unmistakable as she realized she was about to be rescued. Extracting Rodriguez from her hiding place required careful engineering. The debris around her position was precariously balanced, and any wrong move could trigger a collapse that would bury her completely. Snake worked methodically to clear a path, while the rest of the team provided security and monitored insurgent activity. The medical assessment revealed the extent of Rodriguez's condition. She was severely dehydrated, running a high fever from infection, and had lost significant blood from her leg wound. Snake immediately started IV fluids, while Morrison coordinated with headquarters for emergency medical evacuation. The extraction presented new challenges. Rodriguez was unable to walk on her injured leg, and carrying her through hostile territory would be extremely difficult. The insurgent checkpoint was still active, and enemy patrols had actually increased in frequency during the night. Ghost reported that he could see insurgent reinforcements arriving at the checkpoint, suggesting the enemy might have detected some sign of the rescue operation. Morrison made the difficult decision to call for immediate helicopter extraction rather than attempting to move Rodriguez back to their original insertion point. The evacuation helicopter faced intense ground fire as it approached the landing zone. Ghost provided covering fire from his overwatch position, while the rest of the team formed a defensive perimeter around Rodriguez. The sound of the approaching aircraft triggered immediate enemy response, with fighters rushing toward their position from multiple directions. The final moments of the rescue were chaotic and violent. Insurgent forces launched a coordinated attack on the helicopter landing zone, forcing the SEAL team into a desperate firefight while protecting their wounded charge. Rodriguez, despite her condition, provided what support she could with her remaining ammunition. The helicopter touchdown lasted less than 30 seconds. The team loaded Rodriguez aboard, while maintaining suppressive fire against advancing enemy forces. Snake jumped aboard to continue medical treatment during the flight, while the rest of the team provided covering fire until the aircraft was safely airborne. As the helicopter climbed away from Fallujah, Rodriguez looked down at the city where she had spent the most terrifying and challenging days of her life. The ruins below held memories of combat, survival, and ultimate rescue that would stay with her forever. The SEAL team members around her represented the brotherhood of warriors who never leave a comrade behind. The debriefing would come later, along with medals and recognition for both Rodriguez's survival and the SEAL team's successful rescue. But in that moment, flying through the night sky toward medical treatment and safety, the only thing that mattered was that she had survived 18 rounds of combat and 2 days of desperate hiding, and that her brothers in arms had found her alive. Morrison looked at Rodriguez as the medical team worked to stabilize her condition. Her survival represented everything they fought for. The determination to never give up, the bond between soldiers, and the commitment to bring everyone home. The mission was complete. But the story of courage and brotherhood would be remembered long after the war had ended.